George Smith died before publishing his last excavation. That is the first fact I could not get past. On August 19, 1876, in Aleppo at the age of 36, the most gifted cuneiform reader of his generation died on his way home from Mesopotamia, after a third season of work for the British Museum. He had already become famous for recognising the flood story in the tablets from Nineveh. He had already been funded by the Daily Telegraph to go back and recover missing fragments. He had already changed the way the modern world heard ancient Iraq speak, and yet the British Museum's own biographical record still states, in plain language, that the investigations from that last season remained unpublished. I kept returning to that sentence, not because I think one dead Assyriologist carried a forbidden truth out of Nineveh in his pocket. No, I do not. I kept returning to it because it sits there like a hinge in the record. The translator dies, the field moves on, and certain materials survive in catalogues, storerooms, and specialised monographs without ever becoming part of the story most people think they know. As I discussed before, this is usually how difficult material disappears. Not through drama, through filing systems, through disciplinary boundaries, through the simple fact that one person dies, another person classifies, a third publishes a portion, and the original pattern breaks apart. That is where this story begins for me. Not with a secret, with a documented interruption. The mainstream foundation here is solid. Cuneiform was deciphered in the 19th century through the work of Henry Rawlinson and others. A building from the multilingual Behistun inscription. Samuel Birch at the British Museum recognised Smith's talent and brought him into the museum's work on tablet fragments. Later scholars such as Samuel Noah Kramer at the University of Pennsylvania, Thorkild Jacobson at the Oriental Institute in Chicago, W.G. Lambert, Piotr Michalowski, Andrew George, Irving Finkel, and Jonathan Taylor extended, corrected, and translated the textual world of Sumer and Akkad with extraordinary rigour. The electronic text. Corpus of Sumerian literature at Oxford and the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative made still more of that record searchable. This is not fringe ground. It is one of the most documented literary recoveries in the history of scholarship. The excavation history is just as traceable. Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam opened the great Assyrian palaces and libraries at Nineveh and Nimrud. John George Taylor worked at Eridu in the 19th century. Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur between 1922 and 1934 transformed the chronology of early Mesopotamia. Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd dug at Eridu for the Iraqi Directorate of Antiquities in the late 1940s and exposed the stacked temple levels of the Iabzu, the sanctuary of Enki. When modern scholars talk about Eridu as the first city in the king list, or about Nimrud as a Neo-Assyrian centre of ritual deposits, they are not leaning on literary fancy alone. They are standing on excavation trenches, pottery sequences, brick inscriptions, stratified architecture, and museum storerooms accumulated over more than a century. That matters, and because it means the names I am using are not floating free of objects. WEB 444 in Oxford, K.3375, the famous flood tablet in the British Museum, administrative tablets from Ur-3 archives in Philadelphia, Chicago, London, Berlin, and Istanbul. The line from inscription to translation is imperfect, but it is direct enough to be audited. Anyone serious enough can follow it. That is exactly why the silence around certain patterns bothers me as much as it does, and the objects are just as real as the texts. The Ashmolean Museum in Oxford holds the Weld Blundell prism, catalogued as WB444, a clay prism about 20 centimetres high and 9 centimetres wide, inscribed with the most complete surviving version of the Sumerian king list. The British Museum holds over 130,000 cuneiform inscriptions under the care of its Middle East department. The Library of Ashurbanipal alone produced more than 30,000 tablets and fragments. Eridu, Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Nineveh, Nimrud, Sippar, these are excavated sites, not invented names. The Sumerian king list, the Eridu Genesis, the Adapa tradition, the Bitmesseri incantation series, the Uruk list of kings and sages, and Berossus's Babyloniaca all exist within a scholarly record that can be checked, photographed, transliterated, and argued over line by line. Before anything unusual is said, I want that established clearly. We are dealing with museum objects, excavation reports, catalogue numbers, colophons, duplicate manuscripts, philological debates, and named scholars working in public institutions, we are not wandering in the dark. The difficulty is not absence of data, it is what we choose not to do with it. The anomaly is not that ancient Mesopotamian texts contain myth. Of course they do. The anomaly is that one particular cluster of claims appears across genres that should not, at first glance, be carrying the same burden. King lists, incantation series, Hellenistic priestly history, protective deposits beneath palace floors. In all of them, with changing language and changing emphasis, there remains the memory of an age before ordinary kingship settled into recognizable history. And alongside that memory, there remains a second idea, that civilization did not simply emerge, it was transmitted. Not metaphorically transmitted, not in the vague way modern summaries say that cultures attributed their arts to the gods. The texts become more precise than that. They name sages, they place them before or around the flood. They link them to Eridu and to Ea or Enki, lord of the subterranean freshwater abyss. They describe them as keepers of the plans of heaven and earth. And centuries later, long after Sumerian had ceased to be a spoken vernacular, ritual experts in Assyria were still manufacturing small clay figures of those beings and burying them beneath rooms, thresholds, and walls to guard buildings from harm. I want to stay with that for a moment. A literate court culture copied lists of antediluvian sages and then placed miniature bodies representing those sages under the floors of palaces. That is not an interpretation. That is the record. And there is another part of that fact that I find difficult to set aside. By the first millennium BCE, Sumerian was already an ancient scholarly language, and court experts learned it the way later societies learned Latin, through schools, lexical lists, commentaries, and trained memorization. So when Neo-Assyrian and late Babylonian scholars copied these traditions, they were not casually repeating village folklore they happened to hear in the market. They were selecting from an inherited archive. They were preserving something already old, already filtered, already judged worthy of transmission by generations of specialists. That means the memory of the sages survived not by accident but by institutional choice. The mainstream explanation is that this is mythic continuity expressed through apotropaic ritual. That explanation is valid as far as it goes. Ancient people believed in protective beings, therefore they made protective figures. But it does not close the question for me, and because it explains the behavior at the level of category and leaves the content untouched. Why these beings? Why these names? Why this specific coupling of primordial wisdom, flood memory, technical knowledge, and hidden deposits? Why preserve the tradition so carefully if it was only decorative residue? Before moving forward, this deserves attention. There is also the sentence I mentioned at the beginning, and I want to hold it still. The British Museum's biography of George Smith says his 1876 investigations remained unpublished, not lost in war, not destroyed in some dramatic archive fire, unpublished. A museum statement in the present tense about a 19th century expedition. I do not treat that as evidence of hidden revelation, and I treat it as evidence of how easy it is for important material to fall out of narrative circulation, even when the institution itself remembers perfectly well that it exists. Start with the Sumerian king list. In the Oxford translation, the opening is blunt. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridug. Then come the first rulers, Alulim, Alaljar, reign lengths of 28,800 years and 36,000 years. The list proceeds through antediluvian cities, then breaks at the flood, then resumes with post-diluvian dynasties in a form increasingly recognizable as political memory. Scholars have long noted the ideological purpose of the list, to legitimize later dynasties by arranging the past into a single line of kingship. I accept that. But ideological texts still tell us what a culture thought was worth formalizing. And this one formalizes a descent of kingship from heaven into a specific city associated with Enki and the deep. Why preserve impossible reign lengths inside what is otherwise a bureaucratic technology of order? And the surviving object is unnervingly matter-of-fact. The Weldblundell prism in the Ashmolean is not monumental. It is a clay prism, roughly 20 centimeters tall, bored through its center so it could turn on a wooden rod, its four sides covered with dense cuneiform columns. It looks like an administrative tool. That is part of what gives it force. The past it contains is extravagant. The format is not. A sober old Babylonian scribe at Larsa, around 1800 BCE, copied a universe in which kingship descends from heaven and the earliest ruler's reign for durations no historian can literalize. And he did not write this as wild poetry on a temple wall. He wrote it in the compact, disciplined form of a list. What kind of memory gets domesticated into that shape and still refuses to become ordinary? Then turn to the Uruk list of kings and sages and to the first millennium ritual tradition around the Apkallu. There, the first sage is Uana, rendered in later Greek as Oannes, and the old lines describe him as the one who completed the plans of heaven and earth. After him come Wanaduga, Enmeduga, Enmegalama, Enmebeluga, and Enlilda, and Utuabzu. The structure matters. These are not random monsters floating through folktale. They are listed, paired with primeval kings, and treated as transmitters of order. In the Bit Messery series, the sages become ritually active again. Fish Apkallu, Bird Apkallu, Human Apkallu, arranged in prescribed groups, installed at precise locations in the architecture of a house or palace. Why couple kings and sages that formally, unless the relationship carried institutional weight? The old Adapa material deepens that unease. Adapa is the sage of Eridu, priest of Ea, summoned to heaven after breaking the wing of the south wind. Later scholarship has long noticed that the traditions around Adapa and the first Apkallu begin to overlap. The primary sage in late catalogues is sometimes effectively Uan Adapa, the wise being at the threshold between the divine and the human. Again, I am not asking anyone to take mythology as journalism. I am asking what it means that the earliest urban tradition in southern Iraq kept returning to a first sage from Eridu, attached to water knowledge, and a kind of dangerous proximity to the gods. Why did the memory of a primordial instructor remain so stable across texts with such different purposes? Now look at the object I keep coming back to. The Met in New York holds it under accession, number 54.117.25. Apkallu figure, male with a fishskin hood, from Neo-Assyrian Nimrud, roughly 13.5 centimeters high, 4.5 centimeters wide, ceramic made in the 9th or 8th century BCE. It is small enough to stand in the palm of a hand. The figure stares straight ahead with large, wide-open eyes under arched brows. A long beard frames a closed mouth. Both fists press against the chest, right above left, in a pose that feels formal and private at the same time. The rounded headdress is not simply a cap, it is the head of a fish drawn over a human body, and a skin or cloak that turns the man into something not entirely human. The object was found buried under the floor of a room in a palace building at Nimrud. It was not on an altar, it was not in a public shrine, it was placed beneath the surface of inhabited space where no one living in the room would normally see it. Look at this if you can, because no description prepares you. It does not feel symbolic in the weak modern sense. It feels operational. What was this for? George Smith found a related deposit at Nimrud and described it in Assyrian Discoveries in 1875. In one room, he wrote, there was a brick receptacle let into the floor, and under the covering brick he found 6 terracotta winged figures. One of those British Museum figures, DT391, still survives on display in room 55. The museum record says the group probably came from an original deposit of 7. Smith saw the receptacle, lifted the brick, and found the hidden guardians where the ritual text said such things should be. Text and object matched in the ground. Why does that detail not sit nearer the centre of how we tell this story? And then there is Berossus, the Babylonian priest writing in Greek in the early 3rd century BCE. In the fragments preserved by later authors, Oannes emerges from the sea and teaches humanity to found cities, to establish temples, to introduce laws, along with geometry, agriculture and the arts necessary for the settled life. This is already a late. It comes through transmission layers. I understand every caution attached to it. But the internal structure is the same one we have already seen, a not quite human instructor linked to water, appearing at the beginning, carrying civilizational knowledge. I want to sit with that before moving on. If Berossus was simply composing elegant myth for a Hellenistic audience, why does he preserve the same basic grammar as the older Mesopotamian lists and rituals? Once I saw that pattern, the Sumerian material stopped looking isolated. In Vedic India, the Satapatha Brahmana preserves the flood story of Manu and the fish. The fish warns Manu of the coming deluge, instructs him to prepare, and in later Indian retellings the vessel carries seeds, life, and the 7 sages through the catastrophe. In some versions, the boat is tied to the horn of the fish itself, The structure is precise, disaster approaches, being marked by water intervenes, knowledge and life are carried across the break, and the next world begins not from nothing but from preserved instruction. This is not a mood, it is an architecture of memory. The text is specific about warning, preservation, and transmission. How much of civilization is being imagined here as inheritance from a threshold event rather than invention within ordinary time? Move east again. In early Chinese tradition, Fuxi stands near the beginning of order, as a culture founder credited with nets, hunting, and most importantly the trigrams that become the basis of patterned knowledge in later Chinese thought. In Han Dynasty tomb reliefs such as those associated with the Wuliang Shrine, Fuxi and Nuwa appear serpent-bodied, entwined, often holding the square and compass. Are not merely ancestral but cosmological. The details vary across S, but the functional logic remains striking. Civilization is stabilized through a liminal, semi-other figure who delivers technique, classification, and order after primordial disorder. A body that is partly animal, partly human, carries instruction into human time. How does a structure like that recur so far from Mesopotamia without leaving a documented chain of borrowing? Then go to the Andes. Chroniclers recording Andean traditions describe Viracocha emerging after a world-destroying flood associated with the waters of Lake Titicaca, moving through the land naming peoples, assigning languages, and teaching order. At Tiwanaku, the great stone gateway and monolithic figures preserve a monumental memory of beings who stand at the beginning of civilization, rather than within a later dynastic sequence. The point is not whether every late report is pristine, it is that the structural memory survived at all. Catastrophe, survival, emergence from water, instruction, social ordering. A being from beyond the ordinary human community reboots the system. Why is that same sequence so stable? Mesoamerica adds another layer. In central Mexican tradition, Quetzalcoatl is not just a god among gods. He is repeatedly remembered as a donor of arts, calendar, priestly order, and the disciplines that make settled life intelligible. The previous worlds end. A new order follows. Knowledge arrives through a figure who is not merely human and who mediates between realms. In the Codex Borbonicus and in the monumental program of the Temple of the Feathered Serpent at Teotihuacan, the serpent is not incidental decoration. It is part of a logic in which wisdom, time-reckoning, legitimacy, and non-ordinary embodiment travel together. Different imagery, same grammar. Why should technical knowledge so often arrive wearing a body that does not belong wholly to us? These are not vague parallels. This is the same vocabulary appearing independently. How does that happen? I do not mean that every detail matches, because it does not. I mean the deeper pattern holds. A catastrophe or primordial break. A surviving or returning figure marked as liminal, aquatic, serpentine, avian, or otherwise non-ordinary. The transfer of technical, legal, calendrical, agricultural or cosmological knowledge. And the claim that human order begins only after that transfer. Once I saw the Mesopotamian material in that wider frame, I found it increasingly difficult to dismiss the old texts as random accumulations of marvels. They are too organized, they keep doing the same thing. Which I have covered in a previous piece on flood memory, cultures do not preserve what they find irrelevant for 3,000 years. They elaborate it, they ritualize it, they hide it under foundations, they attach it to kingship law and the measured world. And when they do that in multiple places, across long distances, I do not think the responsible response is to leap to a grand theory. And I think the responsible response is to admit that we are looking at a recurring civilizational memory structure that scholarship has described in fragments without ever really confronting whole. There are fair reasons for that failure. Mesopotamian archaeology has been repeatedly broken by politics and war. Work at Eridu under Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd ran in 1946 to 1949, and then for decades the site did not receive the kind of sustained international excavation its importance merited. Iraq went through the 1991 Gulf War, sanctions, the 2003 invasion, mass looting of sites and museums, and later the destruction wrought by the Islamic State. Maguire Gibson wrote that more than 15,000 objects were stolen from the Iraq Museum during the 2003 catastrophe alone. In 2021, Iraq announced the return of more than 17,000 looted artifacts from the United States. Archives were disrupted, travel became dangerous, funding followed safer terrain. Even now, major conservation and digitization projects must compete with the ordinary economics of museums and universities. Some caution in this field is not only understandable, it is morally necessary, but those reasons are not enough. George Smith died in 1876. The British Museum still notes that his third season investigations remained unpublished. That is nearly a century and a half. Eridu, the city placed first in the king list and linked to the sage tradition, went roughly 65 years between the major Iraqi excavations of the late 1940s and the reopening of a formal Iraqi-Italian archaeological mission in the 2010s. So the British Museum's own public material states that it cares for about 130,000 cuneiform inscriptions, and its recent annual reporting refers to digitization work involving 80,000 cuneiform tablets from the Middle East collection. The CDLI has said the number of cuneiform artifacts in public and private collections exceeds 500,000, with far fewer fully catalogued, edited, translated and synthesized. These are not marginal quantities, they are a measure of systemic incompletion. And the incompletion is not only about untranslated tablets, it is about segmentation. One scholar edits the king list as political literature, another catalogues apotropaic figurines, another reconstructs Berossus, another writes on flood traditions, another works on Eridu, another on ritual space beneath Neo-Assyrian floors. Each contribution can be excellent, though the pattern can still vanish between them. Rittig's 1977 study of magically significant small Assyro-Babylonian sculpture put the figurines in order. Philologists gave us the Incantation series. Museum records preserve fine spots and measurements, yet the larger question remains strangely under-asked. Why did a historically sophisticated scribal culture preserve a connected memory of antediluvian sages strongly enough to materialize them under the floors of imperial buildings? I am not describing a coordinated suppression. I am describing something more diffuse than that, and in some ways more troubling. I am describing a field in which the archive is so large, the specialization so narrow, the funding so unstable, and the political damage so severe that anomalous continuities can remain fully visible and still remain unintegrated. Though no one has to hide anything for this to happen. People only have to do competent work inside small fenced areas while the larger shape goes mostly undescribed. The result is a public narrative in which Sumer becomes writing, irrigation, accounting, kingship, and urbanism, all true and all incomplete, while the material those same civilizations preserved about where ordered knowledge came from is treated as ornamental haze. I want to be careful here. I am not saying that fish-cloaked or bird-headed figures beneath Assyrian floors were literal photographs of real beings. I am not claiming that the reign lengths in the Sumerian king list are straightforward chronological data, waiting for modern science to vindicate them. I am not saying that one dead Victorian Assyriologist uncovered a final answer and took it with him to Aleppo. What I am saying is simpler, and for that reason harder to dismiss. Mainstreams show that Mesopotamian scholars preserved named antediluvian sages associated with Eridu, linked them to the correct ordering of heaven and earth, and gave them ritual bodies in clay that were hidden beneath actual buildings. That is in the museum record, in the excavation record, and in the translated texts. If that observation feels larger than the way it is usually discussed, that is because it is. The old scribes did not treat these beings as throwaway folklore. They copied them, listed them, paired them with kings, and materially installed them in architecture. That does not prove the modern theories built on top of them. It does prove that the ancients themselves thought the memory mattered enough to bury it under stone and brick. And once you accept that much, a great deal of modern confidence starts to look premature. We are very quick to tell ourselves that myth explains itself. Usually it does not. Usually it tells you exactly what a society considered non-negotiable, and then leaves you with the burden of deciding whether you are willing to take that valuation seriously. I find this difficult to dismiss, not because it proves too much, but because the official habit is to make it mean too little. So the questions accumulate. Why did the Sumerian king list begin by placing kingship in Eridu after it descended from heaven, instead of beginning with a merely human founding? What exactly were later scholars preserving when they kept copying the names of Yuana and the other Apkallu centuries after Sumerian had passed out a daily speech? The record does not tell us why protective deposits beneath Neo-Assyrian floors needed figures of antediluvian sages rather than generic divine emblems, and I find that absence harder to explain the longer I sit with it. Who was Yuana to them? Why do Berossus, the ritual series, and the king and sage lists keep returning to the same watery threshold between before and after. What did the people sealing the brick receptacle under Nimrud believe would happen if those figures were absent? Why did George Smith's last investigations remain unpublished for so long when the museum that sponsored them never forgot they existed? What precisely were the plans of heaven and earth supposed to mean in a tradition that also counted measures, copied omens, and built empires? We do not know what they thought they were remembering. Under museum light, the little figure does not move. It stands behind a glass now, or in a photograph enlarged on a screen, no longer under a palace floor at Nimrud, no longer wrapped in brick and darkness, no longer part of a hidden circle of 7. The clay is dry, the eyes stay open, the fists remain pressed to the chest in that inward, formal posture that looks less like worship than containment, as if the thing is holding a charge. The fish skin rises over the head, turning a man into an emissary from somewhere below the visible world. Once, this object lived where no visitor could see it. That was the point. It was placed underfoot, under administration, under sleep, under the daily routines of empire. It guarded the room from beneath. And once you have really looked at one of these figures, the ordinary museum labels start to feel insufficient. Figurine? Ceramic? Neo-Assyrian? All correct. None adequate. Those are the words we use for inventory. They are not the words the makers would have used for presents. I think about George Smith lifting a brick in the 19th century and finding a deposit like that still intact. I think about the sequence that follows. The book published, the career accelerated, the third expedition undertaken, the death in Aleppo, the final investigations left unpublished. I think about how often the ancient record reaches us in this broken way, not because the past is mute, but because transmission is fragile. A few men decipher the script. A few institutions hold the objects. A few specialists keep the old words alive. And still, whole patterns can remain in plain view without becoming culturally legible. The temptation at the end of a story like this is to force a conclusion. I do not think the evidence allows that. But I also do not think the evidence allows the usual shrug. A civilization said over and over that ordered life came after an intrusion of knowledge from beyond ordinary humanity. It wrote that claim into king lists and ritual texts. It buried bodies for that claim in clay. It preserved the names. It linked them to the flood, to Eridu, to the deep, to the measured fabric of the world. Then modern scholarship translated each piece, set them in separate compartments, and mostly stopped there. So I end where the object waits. A figure the size of a hand made of clay formed in a mould nearly 3,000 years ago. Eyes open, mouth closed. Hidden once beneath a room in a royal city and now visible to anyone willing to look carefully enough. That figure does not prove the largest thing that can be said about it. It does something more difficult. It keeps the question alive. The oldest records do not tell us who stood at the beginning, but they still leave footprints where a name should be.